All right, welcome everybody to Verra's Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, or SD VISta for short, Nature Framework consultation webinar. I'm Sinclair Vincent, the Director of Sustainable Development Innovation at Verra, and we're happy to have all of you today to hear a little bit about the Nature Framework and set you up to provide comments during our consultation window. To give you an idea of what we're going to cover in our agenda today, we're essentially going to spend most of the time going over the actual draft Nature Framework, including its proposed quantification approach. And you can just jump to the next slide. You'll see the agenda here. We'll spend the majority of time giving you an idea of the types of rules and requirements that we're proposing so that you'll be prepared to kind of dig into those on your own time and provide comments. And then we will go over the consultation timeline and logistics towards the end of the session before going into a question and answer session. You can enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. We'll be able to respond to some in writing and some verbally. But just a reminder that the questions for today that we'll be focusing on answering are those that are clarifying any of the kind of proposals that we outlined today and how to engage in the consultation. If you have comments on the actual proposals, please do submit those in the Google form, which we'll come to in just a little bit. So with that, and before we jump into the overview of the framework, I'd like to hand over to Toby Jansen-Smith, our Chief Program Development and Innovation Officer, to just start us off with a few words.
Thanks, Sinclair. Well, it's a pleasure to help introduce this webinar today. This is a really important topic that's near and dear to many of our hearts, including at Verra. We've been wanting to, for many years, figure out how a robust market mechanism could help drive large-scaled up finance to biodiversity conservation and restoration activities. And that really started to come together about 18 months ago when a group of leading NGOs and other practitioners, including Conservation International, Conservation Finance Initiative, Great Barrier Reef Foundation, IUCN, and McKinsey, and the Biodiversity Consultancy came together and approached us, and we started working together basically to develop a market mechanism, a standards framework and methodology that could actually start to quantify the biodiversity value and impact that conservation and restoration activities could have, and do that in a standardized way that could start to unlock large-scale finance to tackle this really intense an ever-present crisis that really hasn't been addressed substantially through other means of finance and support. So we're really excited to be making progress with the framework. It's been supported by an amazing group of 25 advisory group members that's very diverse from across the world in terms of different NGOs, governments, academics, practitioners, etc., who are also looking to unlock new sources of finance for this for the biodiversity crisis. And we're at the point now where, after all the various iterations and development of the framework, we really want to hear from you all in terms of this public consultation to start to refine and start to zero in on the right ways that the biodiversity can be accounted for and credited. So this webinar is really just to give an overview of where we're at and start to tee up some of the questions we're posing and what input we'd like, with the goal of releasing the framework in the spring of next year, and hopefully seeing things like this start to work their magic and start to make a real difference in biodiversity conservation and restoration around the world. So I'll hand it back to Sinclair.
Great, thank you. And one last note before we jump into the overview is that this session is, of course, being recorded and will be posted on the Verra website later today. So if you'd like to refer back to it or share with any of your colleagues that weren't able to make it, of course, if they're registered, they'll receive the recording in their email as well. And one other note is just that I'm joined by a few of our other colleagues, one Amy Tome, who is the Manager of Sustainable Development Innovation. And if you are a pilot project for the Nature Framework, you've likely been in touch with her. And then we also have Graham Prescott from the Biodiversity Consultancy, who is part of the team at the Biodiversity Consultancy, who has been supporting Verra with the technical development of our Nature Framework. In just a moment, I'll introduce our other speaker, Lorena. So with that, we'll get started with our overview of the framework, and really just want to let you know what our objective is for the Nature Framework. So we're really looking to certify and incentivize widespread investment in measurable positive biodiversity outcomes benefiting both nature and people. And for the Nature Framework's purposes, we've defined positive biodiversity outcomes as an increase in the amount or quality of biodiversity relative to a baseline that results from the effective management of conservation and restoration projects. So this is what we're aiming to achieve with the Nature Framework. And so we do hope that all of your comments will help us get there and ensure that we're actually putting something forward that is rigorous, but also practical and feasible to implement on the ground. So with that, I'll hand it over to my other colleague, Lorena, who will walk us through some of the objectives and how we designed the framework, how it's structured, and some of the key requirements in there. So Lorena, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself and get started.
Thank you, Sinclair. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Lorena Arredondo Tagle, and I'm a manager of Sustainable Development Innovation at Verra. I'm very happy to be here, and as Sinclair just mentioned, I'll start by presenting the Nature Framework's key design objectives. These objectives are the foundation on which the Nature Framework proposals were designed, given how complex biodiversity is and how it interacts with people. I'll highlight the objective and a few notes on where or how it's reflected in our Nature Framework document, and later today throughout the presentation, we'll dig into the details. So first, nature credits should be applicable across different types of biodiversity and for terrestrial, marine, and freshwater realms. This objective is reflected by using the ecosystem concept as a basis for measurement, since ecosystem extent and condition are the biodiversity metrics that we're using to calculate nature credits. A quick note on this, right now the Nature Framework is more developed for the terrestrial realm, and details for the marine and freshwater ones will be added in the next iterations. Second objective is to establish a balance between standardization and flexibility. And here the proposal is to measure certain ecosystem condition components such as structure and composition, to have a recognized science-based framework that helps us standardize, but is also flexible by allowing that project select appropriate indicators that are locally suitable for each context for each of these components. And the third objective is to establish a balance between rigor and accessibility. And this is included in three main ways in the Nature Framework. First is that we're measuring outcomes. The second is the way that we're proposing to establish the crediting baseline. And the third is the flexible approach to financial additionality, also included in the Nature Framework. The fourth objective is to promote confidence and integrity in nature credits. And this is nature credits represent measured on the ground outcomes. They are not projections. And also this objective is included by linking the condition measures to a desired ecosystem state, which we also call reference state. And this allows for a clear interpretation of outcomes and helps us to avoid distortions from varying baselines. Next slide, please. Thank you. Objective 5 is to support conservation of ecosystems at high risk of biodiversity loss. And here the Nature Framework incorporates avoided loss and restoration in a single accounting method with equal weighting, because effectively addressing biodiversity loss requires us to prevent future biodiversity loss and addressing threats, but also restoring degraded biodiversity. Number 6 is to build on the lessons of the voluntary carbon markets. And experience has shown that project-by-project baselines may not always be robust, and the Nature Framework adapts recent advances from Verra's consolidated RED methodology and proposes eco-regional baselines analogous to jurisdictional RED baselines to be developed by third parties rather than by individual project developers. Number 7 is that projects transparently report their contributions to global conservation priorities, and this helps buyers make informed investments in nature. This is achieved by the significance attributes that indicate how the project is relevant to different targets of the global biodiversity framework, and these are assigned based on project location. It's important to mention that these attributes don't impact the number of nature credits generated, but rather they help buyers aligned with their nature positive goals and their desired contributions to those goals for nature. And finally, number 8, that is like kind of dashed a little bit there because it's not a concrete proposal, but more like a first exploratory idea, is this proposal for Verra of including nature stewardship credits as a separate asset type generated under the nature framework, with clear criteria for demonstrating active and effective stewardship using a different measurement approach. And we'll talk about that in a bit. In this figure, the slide shows how Verra's SD VISta program and nature framework interact. The inner circle shows the rules and requirements which all projects that seek to issue nature credits must comply with. In yellow, in the top part, are the SD VISta program rules and requirements, and those are included in different documents, such as the program guide, the standard, and the templates. And in dark red below, the additional requirements, safeguards, and methodology to monitor and quantify the biodiversity outcomes, which are included in the nature framework. Then we also will have in the future ecosystem or biome-specific modules to be developed, and these will contain additional requirements such as selection of relevant indicators or impacts. We'll prioritize the module development with the results from the ongoing piloting process. And the outer circles contain 2 very important complementary processes. In green, we have the independent auditing that all SD VISta projects need to be assessed by qualified independent third parties to make sure that all the rules and requirements in the center are met. And independent auditing happens at 2 different moments. First, when the project design is assessed, and this is a process known as validation. And then after the project is implemented and what's assessed are the outcomes. So this is also known as the verification. And in blue to the right, it's the registry system. And this is the Verra registry that tracks the generation, retirement, and cancellation of SD VISta assets. The nature stewardship credits are proposed by Verra because we recognize that successful conservation requires long-term commitment, and indigenous peoples, local communities, and other stewards have been doing this effective conservation for decades, that even though it's not under imminent threat, it could become threatened if the stewardship is undermined. So not the restoration or avoided loss outcomes as currently drafted in the nature framework adequately reflect these long-term benefits of stewardship. So a different approach is required and the resulting units must be different. Verra is exploring then in the public consultation to reward successful verified nature conservation and management outcomes as different units. And the proposal is essentially for the projects to maintain extent and high condition of a certain project, and also adding 2 other components. First is to effectively and actively manage the area, and this could be done, for instance, through governance by a recognized management authority or through management planning and implementation plans, and include also as a third first thought to include specific significance attributes, but that are minimum thresholds. For instance, being viable populations of species assessed as globally threatened on the IUCN Red List, or meeting the criteria for global key biodiversity areas, being internationally recognized areas like the UNESCO Man and the Biosphere Reserves. So this is like the proposal on the nature stewardship credits or certificates. Next slide, please. Now I'll share a brief overview of the proposed requirements. The full requirements are, of course, contained in the document and available for you to read them through and provide us your input on. In these first 2 concepts, projects must begin implementing activities on or after January 1st, 2019, and complete the validation of its project design within 5 years from the start date. Also, the project's biodiversity outcomes are eligible for being issued as nature credits for a period of at least 20 years, up to 100 years, and they must be verified on stages of 5 years. Could be less, but the longest verification period should be 5 years. Next slide, please. For project boundary, projects must identify their geographic boundary, including providing the coordinates, and along with the impacts that they will be causing. And these can be different types. They can be primary, secondary, intended, and unintended. And the way that this will be mapped for the nature framework is using a causal chain approach. The baseline scenario for SD VISta as a program, it requires projects to provide a baseline scenario on people, their prosperity, and the planet. And this includes the conditions that were happening before the project start. In addition, projects must describe the events most likely to occur in terms of the biodiversity outcomes without the project activities, and justify why this is the most viable alternative, considering, for instance, data available or other relevant information such as threats, present and future condition, etc. Next slide, please. For additionality, projects must demonstrate the 3 steps that are included here in the slide. For step 1, they need to demonstrate that activities are not mandated by laws, statutes, or other regulatory frameworks. For steps 2, they need to demonstrate that the activities generating outcomes depend on credit finance, or that there are barriers to accessing other finance sources. However, the nature framework also considers the possibility of existing supplementary funding sources, such as philanthropy or carbon credits, for project activities. And in this case, the project proponent needs to demonstrate that implementation barriers exist to the long-term activities and the achievement of the desired biodiversity outcomes. And the third bullet here is to prevent double counting. Of course, they must demonstrate that are not credited under a different program. For benefit sharing, the project must establish a mechanism to ensure customary rights holders, indigenous peoples, and local communities are recognized and rewarded. And it must be consistent with local regulations shared with communities in a locally and culturally appropriate way. And they must demonstrate full and effective decision-making from these stakeholders or rights holders. All of it must be transparent, and outcomes should be publicly available. In safeguards for biodiversity outcomes, we have a specific section in the nature framework, and it includes safeguards, for instance, to a minimum of 40 years in which projects must monitor their impacts and account for their projects' reversals. Also, for instance, assessing the drivers of biodiversity loss, and the creation of a shared buffer account that consists of 20% of nature credits for potential reversals. For sustainable development safeguards, we divided them into 5 categories. The first one aims at reducing risks for customary rights holders and other local stakeholders, and relates to many things. For example, that the project developer has the sufficient capacity to deliver the benefits, that it includes the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities in the project design and implementation, compliance with local laws, for instance, on terms of health and safety or workers' relations, and also overall promoting equality in the project with a special focus on gender equality. The second category relates to human rights, and it details how project proponents must uphold and respect them, including indigenous peoples' treaties, avoiding discrimination, harassment, prohibited forced labor, child labor, modern slavery, or trafficked persons. Next slide, thank you. The third category is ecosystem health, and it encompasses safeguards to ensure that projects do not negatively impact terrestrial or freshwater or marine biodiversity or ecosystems. And it includes, for instance, reduction of pollution, water use, water stress, and of course it touches on the topics of invasive species, monocultures, etc. The fourth category, property rights, includes safeguards to ensure that project proponents recognize, respect, and support all stakeholders' customary and statutory rights to resources and tenure, including the rights to participate in and consent to consultation during project design, but also continuing through the project implementation. The requirements include identifying, of course, the statutory and customary tenure, prohibitions to encroach, ensuring no involuntary removal or relocation, And one of the key requirements is in obtaining and maintaining free, prior, and informed consent of stakeholders whose property rights are affected. Finally, the fifth section, please, next slide. Thank you. Includes requirements for project proponents to identify customary rights holders and other stakeholders involved in the project and engage with them in a way that's culturally and locally appropriate. It also touches on topics of open communication channels and providing them access to timely and adequate information for decision making. So that's it for me. Back to Sinclair for the rest of the presentation.
Great, thank you, Lorena. So now to get into the quantification proposal in the draft framework, we are going to provide a high-level overview of the quantification approach. And you'll notice, as with all of the requirements in the draft consultation document, there are a series of questions for each section to help us dig into each of our proposals and iterate on them for the next version. So you'll see a number of those also in the quantification section, and it'll be really important to hear from all of you on how we've proposed projects would quantify their biodiversity outcomes. So if we jump to the next slide, you'll see the first few steps, and this quantification approach is focusing on project's extent and ecosystem condition. So of course you would need to establish the extent and condition at the project's start. So to do so, coming to the first step here, the project would need to measure its extent, which is essentially its area measured in hectares. And this would need to be done for each ecosystem type in the project area. You would then select appropriate condition indicators for each ecosystem type. And actually the asterisk that you see here on these diagrams indicate when you need to do a certain step for each ecosystem type. So you select appropriate condition indicators, and you'll see in the document that we have prescribed not these specific indicators, but rather the number of kind of indicator categories that each project would need to be monitoring. So for example, we've prescribed a number of composition and structure indicators that should be tracked for each ecosystem type. So once you've selected the appropriate indicators, you will define the reference value for each of those indicators. And you do this because we're asking you to essentially standardize each of your indicator values on a scale of 0 to 1, with 0 being fully degraded and 1 being representative of the reference or pristine state for that specific indicator. We've outlined a series of options for how you could define your reference value, so what sources of data and so on that you could use. So it'd also be helpful to get your input on those suggestions. But once you've defined that reference value for your condition indicators, then you need to actually look to measuring each of those condition indicators in your project area for each ecosystem type. Once you've gotten that initial measurement, so that measurement at year 0, you would standardize each of your condition indicators by their reference value. So on that 0 to 1, as you see here on the right side of the screen. And then you'll combine those indicators into an overall estimate of condition. And finally, multiply that combined estimate by your extent or area to calculate what we're calling the condition adjusted area in quality hectares. So going to the next slide, you'll see the input from step 7, where you've calculated your condition adjusted area in quality hectares across all of your ecosystem types. And then you're going to establish your crediting baseline. And what we've proposed here is using an eco-regional projected trend for ecosystem loss. And this is an approach that will need to be further developed by Verra, the biodiversity consultancy, and potentially other experts if we think that this will be the best approach moving forward, depending on input we receive in the consultation. So what we would be asking projects to do is to calculate the expected trend in project condition in the absence of the project intervention. And that would be based on locally allocated eco-regional baselines, like I said, set by third parties. So you would essentially be able to select what your eco-regional baseline is based off of third-party work done in leadership by Verra, and then project your trend from your starting condition that you measured in the steps on the previous slide. From there, you would actually calculate, just go back once for 1 minute, there we go. So from there, you would calculate the condition adjusted area throughout your project's implementation. So at each monitoring period, you'll assess the change in extent and condition during project implementation and sum that across your ecosystem types. So you're essentially repeating steps 4 through 7 on the previous slide for each monitoring period. And now going to the next slide, the way you then calculate your net biodiversity impacts is by taking the difference between project impacts and the crediting baseline and summing that across ecosystem types. We do then ask you to subtract leakage from that equation. You'll see in the document that we have a few suggestions for how we could approach the quantification of leakage that we're looking for input on, and then we develop the full step once we get that input. But leakage is an important concept for nature credits. So you'd subtract that from the difference between your project impacts and your crediting baseline. And then you'd also calculate your shared buffer account contribution. And finally, calculate your nature credits by deducting that buffer contribution from your biodiversity impacts. So like I said, this is a very high-level overview of the approach that we're proposing for quantification. There are a series of questions that we'll ask you in that document to help us then figure out how and where we need to further develop each part of this proposal. So jumping to the next part of requirements that all projects would need to follow is around biodiversity significance. So in the Nature Framework, significance is defined as the importance of biodiversity in the project area for contributing to the Global Biodiversity Framework, and specifically 4 of the targets listed under Goal A of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So what we've done is we're trying to allow projects to demonstrate an attribute layer of significance that will hopefully provide buyers additional information to help them identify how projects contribute to particular global goals for nature. But it's not necessarily the case that every project will be scoring in a certain way across all of these attributes. Rather, it's more of a informational dashboard of whether and how projects relate to 4 specific targets. We've identified tiers that represent sort of 20th percentile thresholds of quantitative indicators for each of these 4 targets that would be displayed in simple maps developed by Verra and the Biodiversity Consultancy. So if you jump to the next slide, you can kind of see the detail. This is also provided in the consultation documents of the 4 targets that we are proposing each project identify whether and how they contribute to. However, target 1 and target 2 are only answered or reflected by projects that are relevant. For example, target 1 would only be required for conservation projects to demonstrate, and target 2 would be required for restoration projects. Of course, if you're a combined activity type project, you would need to identify your contribution or sort of your tier and 20th percentiles against both targets 1 and 2. And then all projects would identify their rank for targets 3 and 4. And just to quickly share that this slide that you see here is also in the consultation document, but it provides an example of what it would look like at the front of a project document, where it shows each of these 4 targets and how the project relates to it. So for a conservation project, as I mentioned, you would have to show how you relate to target 1. In this case, in this example, it's given a rank of A because it's a pristine area, which highly relates to conservation of high ecological integrity areas. And then on the other side, it might be somewhere like a rank of B for halting extinction and reducing extinction risk, just based on its potential to reduce species extinction based on its location and the maps that we would develop. So this is just to give a little bit of an illustration of how it would look essentially as a dashboard for every project. It is not to say that if a project has a lower or higher ranking that it is better or worse than another, but rather just how it relates to these specific targets under the Global Biodiversity Framework. So moving into the next set of slides is a little bit on claims and communications. So jumping to the next one, we do want to draw your attention to a section of the document where we outline what credible claims would entail for projects and the resulting credits coming from projects under Verra's Nature Framework. So I won't walk through all of the detail here, but it's to say that we have given some guidelines on how a validated project, but not yet verified, should communicate about its activities, as well as then for verified projects, how you would communicate about your activities, and also how a buyer of those credits can and should communicate about the investment that they've made in those projects by purchasing those credits. And then the last example is about the nature credits themselves and what they represent, and what a high quality, high integrity claim includes if you are communicating about your projects or the credits resulting from them. We do have an ability to push back where we see that claims are being made inappropriately. And so this is an important section to also get your input on to make sure that the guidance is clear for the final version of the framework. So moving into the next section, which is perhaps one of the most important sections, and we'll want to continue to build this out in our thinking and hearing from the market on this, but it's about the value proposition and use case for nature credits. We do get this question a lot, and I think the entire market is looking into this and ensuring that the way that we design this framework is aligned with the types of claims and action that companies or investors are looking to make alongside their purchases of nature credits. So nature credits provide companies a verified way to support high quality projects, as well as Indigenous peoples and local communities, while also addressing their impacts and dependencies on nature by de-risking their value chains. So Target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework talks about ideally requiring large corporations and financial institutions to monitor, report, and disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature. Of course, this is a fairly new requirement or framework that's in place just last year in December. And then there are reporting disclosure frameworks like the TNFD that have only just now come out. And so while we haven't seen too many companies be able to report their impacts and dependencies just yet, we do think that this will be ramping up, and that provides kind of the clear use case for nature credits. In particular, it is important to explain and clarify what the use case is, because nature credits are not meant to be used as offsets. Rather, they're meant to be positive investments in nature and hopefully align with a nature positive construct, which also is kind of in the development phase across the market, but hopefully will come out similar to what we see in net zero type commitments for carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, climate. We'll hopefully see evolve in sort of a nature positive construct. But for now, what we hope companies are starting to think about are their impacts on nature and dependencies on nature. So in that impacts use case, we see an opportunity for companies to invest beyond their mitigation hierarchy for accumulated existing impacts or industry or sector-wide impacts that are not attributable to individual entities. So there could be impacts made by a particular sector that one company is not necessarily responsible for or tied to, but do relate to that sector where companies could step up to make those investments beyond their mitigation hierarchy to address impacts. The other use case is around dependencies. So this would be an area where companies are looking to secure their reliance on functional ecosystems and their services, like their ability to regulate water flow or water quality. If your supply chain depends on nature, pollinators, crop production, you are also dependent on ecosystem services and the biodiversity in those areas. And so I think we'll end up seeing companies who, once they actually assess their dependencies on nature, will want to then secure those dependencies on nature in both an environmentally and socially sustainable way, but also for their business into the future. So these are the areas that we see kind of making the use case for nature credits. While they're not offsets, they are positive investments in nature and do need to tie back to a company's overarching efforts to address and support nature. So next slide here is just about the relationship between Verra's nature and carbon credits. And I think I saw a couple questions coming in on this topic. So hopefully this will answer your questions, at least for now, and then also give you the opportunity to provide comments during the consultation. So jumping to the next slide, we are developing the nature framework with the idea that we would enable the stacking of nature and carbon credits. And maybe first I can just quickly explain the difference between stacking and bundling, at least in a very simple way. So stacking is essentially where you would have a project that's generating carbon and nature credits or biodiversity credits that wants to generate those from the same project, but sell those 2 units separately, so to 2 different buyers, because they represent 2 different benefits or outcomes. That's compared to bundling, where again, those 2 different unit types are generated from the same project, but are sold together and cannot be separated. So just to be clear, the framework as written would allow for either stacking or bundling. I think there's still a lot of room in the market to discuss what makes the most sense, both from a project perspective to ensure that projects are actually receiving the amount of finance they need to cover their costs and actually implement their activities and generate positive biodiversity outcomes. And so we wouldn't want to risk that if they're not actually able to recoup that cost through stacking or bundling. But also the other key component of this is ensuring that projects are able to comply with the requirements in both the nature framework and, in this case, the verified carbon standard, the VCS program, especially around additionality. So that we're actually crediting, additional benefits for people and their prosperity, and that we're helping companies and projects help us get to nature, hopefully nature positive, that construct, and net zero at the same time. So we'd love to hear your input on the stacking or bundling question in this part of the consultation document. And just note that we will, if it is agreed that we should allow this, we do need to make sure that those requirements are as aligned as possible to make it easy for projects to be able to quantify and report on their climate and biodiversity benefits. Okay, so that was a lot of content. And so that, I guess, makes sense with the 79 pages in the consultation document that we're very appreciative of all of you reviewing. But we wanted to also give you a little bit of an idea of the logistics and timeline for how to engage in this consultation. So the next slide outlines both the timeline and logistics. So we launched this public consultation on September 18th, just a couple of weeks ago, and it will run through November 19th. So you do have quite a while to go to review that document and provide your comments. And it is our goal to then review those comments through November, December, and ideally get those comments out for your understanding of how we plan to address them in the beginning of 2024. And then that will inform the next version of the nature framework that would likely go out for consultation in early 2024. And as Toby mentioned earlier, this is all helping us build up to what we're planning to release the nature framework in the middle of next year. Now, how do you actually provide your comments? We do ask that you provide your comments using the online template. So it's a Google form that is linked in all of our announcement materials for you to fill out. You'll see that there are specific fields for each of the specific consultation questions that we've posed to you. So if you'd like to answer that question, you can do so in the specific kind of box for that question in the form. But then there's also an open box for each section. So if you'd like to just provide general comments on a given section, you can do so easily using that form. And I think those are the main logistics. We are very appreciative of all the comments that you are able to provide, and hopefully we'll now have a bit of time to answer some of the questions that have been coming in through the Q&A over the last few minutes. So I might hand over to Lorena to see if we've got a few to get us started.
Yes, thank you, Sinclair. I'm gonna start sharing more or less in order of appearance, so to speak. First question is, and this was answered also in the chat, but is it an offset framework? And what is Verra's relationship with the Biodiversity Credits Alliance?
Sure, I can take that one. So yes, this is not meant to be, nature credits are not meant to be used as offsets. And I think that is widely agreed upon in the market. So for other standards developers or methodology developers in this biodiversity credit space, it's well understood that biodiversity credits are not meant to be used as offsets compared to actual biodiversity offsetting programs that are locally based. This is a global framework. There are not requirements for where a company would have to purchase a credit from, what type of project, and therefore these are meant to represent positive investments in nature. And then I think the second part of the question was about the Biodiversity Crediting Alliance. Is that right, Lorena?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So the Biodiversity Crediting Alliance is doing a lot of great work on kind of bringing together a lot of the stakeholders that are operating in this nascent market to kind of help set certain thresholds for quality, as well as just understanding of what we're trying to achieve in this market and how technology can play a role there, as well as how Indigenous peoples and local community voices can actually be heard from the very beginning of this market and throughout its development and implementation. And so that's, I think, going to prove quite useful as that work evolves. And so Verra to date has been involved in sort of the group that they lead that's focused on the standards bodies that are participating in the market so far. And hopefully we'll be able to kind of leverage the wide participation that the BCA has seen to be able to set the threshold at the right level for quality and ensuring integrity in this market, while also making sure that any standards that are in this space are practical and easy to implement on the ground, because of course we only have so much time to start actually generating positive biodiversity outcomes before it is a bit too late.
Great, thank you very much for those answers. We have another question here. Can Verra framework work together with TNFD?
Yeah, it's a good question. So while the TNFD and Verra's nature framework aren't, puzzle pieces, they are very related in that the TNFD is going to help companies actually figure out how to disclose their impacts, dependencies, and so on when it comes to nature. And nature credits are sort of for companies to think about kind of beyond their mitigation hierarchy. And so while there's not a requirement in the TNFD to be using the nature framework, we have designed the nature framework so that the metrics that we're using and asking projects to bring into their project are aligned with those that would be asked for in the TNFD. Of course, now that the TNFD's final version is out, we'll continue to make sure that our nature framework is as aligned as possible and where it needs to be aligned, but they're not necessarily linked in any formal way at this point.
Great, thank you. We have another question here that relates to the use of carbon and carbon credits and the nature framework. Would carbon projects registered under other standards different from BCS be eligible for SD VISta Nature Framework?
Yeah, so this is a question we'll probably have to come back to and in the future iterations, but I think in principle, yes. However, if you are looking to sort of stack or bundle and we decide that is an eligible approach, I would just point out that, of course, Verra is going to be working to align its nature framework with Verra's greenhouse gas program, whereas other standards bodies out there will probably be aligning their biodiversity-related programs and their own greenhouse gas programs if they have them. So it could require a little bit more work on the project's part to kind of follow a little bit different set of rules and requirements from different programs. But I would stay tuned on that. Ideally, projects would be able to mix and match if it makes the most sense for their projects and their investors. But we'll have to come back to that one in due course.
Great. We have another question here related to the causal chain and just perhaps clarifying a bit what is a causal chain approach? Yes,
and if we didn't mention it at the beginning of the webinar, I do want to highlight that we have included as sort of supplementary document to this consultation a summary or overview of SD VISta. Because the Nature Framework nests under SD VISta as an asset methodology, we felt it was important to give folks that aren't familiar with SD VISta and how it works sort of a quick tutorial on what SD VISta really is and how it works. And so the causal chain is a key element of the SD VISta program that all projects using that standard and program have to use in their project. So a causal chain is essentially visually it's a graphic on a page, but it's you essentially take each intervention or activity that you have in the project and then try to outline the kind of impacts or outcomes of those interventions. So whether they're the direct or indirect effects of your interventions, you would need to track those, as well as positive or negative impacts of any of your interventions. You track those and build them into a graphic that's altogether called a causal chain. And the idea of doing that is to make sure that you are accounting for any potential negative impacts, but also aware of all of the benefits that your project is generating, because SD VISta allows for projects to align their benefits across any of the 17 SDGs that are relevant to the outcomes. So that causal chain is really the kind of core that tool that projects use to be able to demonstrate what their benefits and outcomes actually are, and to ensure that they're having net positive benefits at the end of their project.
Great, thank you. And perhaps also linking another one that's somehow related to Verra programs is like, how does this framework differ from the biodiversity aspects of Verra at CCB?
Yeah, so we, as you know, if you use any of our programs, there are sort of building blocks of how they relate to nature or biodiversity. So perhaps first starting with the VCS program, that is our voluntary greenhouse gas program, and there are safeguards built into that standard. Those are essentially do no harm requirements, and some of them are specific to ecosystems and biodiversity to ensure that a carbon project is not having negative impacts on the biodiversity or ecosystems in that area. This is especially important because you could unintentionally have negative impacts through the implementation of a carbon project, and we want to prevent that. So that's why we have do no harm sort of safeguards in the VCS program. Moving beyond that, though, we have a program called the Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Standards, or the CCB program, and that allows projects that are in the land use sector specifically to not only look at their greenhouse gas benefits, but also the benefits to communities and biodiversity in their project area. And so those requirements kind of take it to a next level on a beyond safeguards, beyond a do no harm level, but actually require positive impacts on biodiversity and communities in that area. However, the CCB standards don't currently provide a quantification method for those benefits related to biodiversity or communities. Rather, it's the project's job to ensure that they're quantifying those benefits appropriately in the project context. And so where the Nature Framework can help is actually providing a quantification methodology for the biodiversity elements of projects. There is some work to be done on Verra's part to make sure that all of our programs, and with this new one coming, this new Nature Framework asset methodology under SD VISta, to make sure that the programs are aligned and easy to use, or that you know as a potential project developer which one makes the most sense for you based on your project context. So that's also something that we'll be working on as kind of communications materials to help projects navigate these different programs and ensure that they're, if you're using multiple programs, that you're able to do so in an efficient and streamlined manner.
Thank you, Sinclair. We have a few questions on the more technical aspects of the requirements and the quantification, so I'll try to gather as many in a few questions. But the first one is about, there are some questions about the buffer pool, and then one of them is like, is the 20% buffer a minimum criteria?
Yeah, this is a great question because it's good to highlight, because I think we're looking for some specific inputs. As I mentioned, there are questions throughout the document, and there's certainly a question on the buffer pool. So we have proposed a standard buffer allocation of 20% for all projects. However, we've posed a question in the document seeking input on whether and how we could, instead of offering or requiring a 20% flat contribution to the buffer, allowing projects to have a smaller or requiring them to have a bigger buffer contribution based on the risk profile of the project. So for example, if a project has low risk or is implementing a lot of mitigation action to really reduce that risk, they could perhaps drop their buffer allocation down to 10%, for example. Whereas there could be other projects that are, highly risky, they're doing great work and are generating positive biodiversity outcomes, but there is more risk than perhaps a kind of average project, in which case we could require those projects to have a greater contribution than 20%. That is an area where we'd really like to receive input from you all on the practicalities of that, and what are the sort of risk profiles or criteria that we should include in any sort of tool or rules that we create around identifying which percentage is relevant for your project for buffer contribution.
Thank you. And a follow-up or another question related to the buffer credits is, what happens to the buffer credits if there is no reversal? Do they count as extra credits from the project to carry over to the next monitoring period?
Yes, it's also an interesting question, and Toby, feel free to add in here based on our experience in carbon, but the answer is no, that they are not extra credits, but they stay in that buffer pool to ensure, there could be a reversal in the future. And so it's hard to know, even after your 20 or 40-year longevity period, whether or not there would be one. And so those credits remain in that buffer pool. At least that's how it's currently proposed. But Toby, I don't know if you'd like to add based on how this has worked in the AFLU space and carbon.
No, that's kind of how we probably envision it. But again, would welcome any feedback on that. There are potential for releasing credits if after a certain period a project has not had reversals or the pool is at a certain health. But generally, as Sinclair said, we want to make sure the long-term integrity is maintained. So that would probably mean keeping the buffer credits in the pool. And then it's a question of how you monitor and actually make sure if there are losses, do you cancel credits, or you just actually assume that the 20% is generally sufficient and, hold them or cancel them after a certain period. So yeah, there's different design options there. And if people want to weigh in on that, they'd be more than welcome.
Thank you, Toby and Sinclair. We also had a few questions about the more the part of the indicators or the condition. So first, we have a question: are the condition indicators case specific or to be selected from a predefined list?
Sure, maybe I can start, and Graham, if you'd like to add a little bit on indicator selection. We do not currently have a predefined list. Instead, we are asking projects to select a particular number of indicators that fall within certain categories. For example, structure or composition as different elements of ecosystem condition. We're asking for projects to ensure that they're monitoring at least the minimum number of indicators that we've prescribed in each of those categories, rather than specifying the specific indicators themselves. But Graham, would you like to add a little bit to some of our thinking behind the indicator selection and appropriateness?
No, it's a great question, and maybe I can also touch on the issue of reference states as well, because that's a related question. So I think there are a lot of design trade-offs to make in this, between being prescriptive and potentially excluding particular use cases and being quite flexible. So the current, and we would like feedback on this, because different people can reasonably disagree on this. We've generally opted towards flexibility to make sure that this can be applicable globally. We had a lot of questions saying, is this applicable in Europe? Is this applicable in agricultural lands? It is. We're trying to make this an applicable framework everywhere in the world. So that means we cannot specifically, to enable that, it's better to have some flexibility, but to provide guidance on what are good types of metrics. We've given guidance on, robust indicators. So we'll provide guidance, but leave it up to the project. But the project has to provide a certain number of indicators and to sort of justify why they've chosen it. So that's our sort of current leaning, give a good steer and give a sort of quality checklist, but provide some guidance, some flexibility to project developers. And we also had a few questions so in the chat about how a reference baseline is set. That's one where there are a lot of reasonable ways to do it. So you can use the sort of best available intact habitat. So that's what we've marked as kind of ideal, but you can also use, there are a lot of places where a project will be operating in an area where the pristine ecosystem is long gone, and they can use sort of use ecological models or historical information to calculate the best, the reference state. So we've given some flexibility for project developers to explain, to figure out the best method for that location, justify it, and report how they did that. But that is something we'd like feedback, because obviously that could create a lot of variation in the reference state used. And so, there's always a trade-off between flexibility, knowing that project developers might know best in their particular location, versus being very prescriptive across the board. So lots of reasonable opinions on that, that we expect lots of disagreement. So please feedback on that.
Great, thank you. I think we might have time for another question, and there's one quite interesting about the third parties and the crediting baseline, and who will be these third parties developing the crediting baseline.
Yeah, again, maybe I could start, and then Graham, if you want to add just a little bit about our thinking and approach, should we pursue this further? So by third parties, we actually mean Verra would lead a process with third parties to build out this approach completely. And so we would essentially be establishing what baselines are at an eco-regional level, and as proposed with risk allocation across the eco-region based on known pressures. However, that requires a little bit more work than what's in the consultation document. So perhaps, Graham, you can talk a little bit about kind of what it would take to do that. But just to quickly answer the question, the third party in this case is Verra and technical experts. So actually, we're trying to reduce the burden completely on projects from having to establish project by project baselines. But Graham, anything to add just quickly?
Yes, so the philosophy would be building on work done in the academic community by technical experts who have developed, for example, the eco-regional intactness index for particular, eco-regional intactness index, so kind of Verra et al, for example, for the terrestrial realm, or the marine cumulative human impact index for the marine realm. So there are a lot of there are a lot of proof of concepts out there in the academic literature about how we can use existing data on trends in eco-regional intactness for different realms that can be used to the baseline. And obviously, because they've been published as academic exercises with limited funding, they've not been done in a sort of annualized time series. So the approaches exist to use remote sensing data and modeled human pressure data to estimate how eco-regional intactness at fine scale is changing across the world, but it would require upfront funding to aid the technical development. So the concept exists, the underlying data sets exist, but some work is needed to develop that into a usable, annually updated layer.
Great. So with that, I think we'll try to wrap it up. Again, thank you all for joining this webinar and sharing the recording when you get the link with your colleagues who may have missed it. You will be able to refer back to the slides. I saw there's a question about that in the chat, so please do so if that makes it easy for you to kind of take some time to digest. Use the Google form for providing your comments, and let us know if you have any questions. You can email info@verra.org for questions that are kind of generally related to Verra. And perhaps the last slide had Lorena's email address on it for questions related to the Nature Framework. And I will say that we'll try to take all the questions that we received, because we were not able to get to all of them, and build those into our FAQ that we'll be providing on the Nature Framework in due course. So thank you. Those questions are super helpful and will also inform the next iteration of the framework. And yes, please do feel free to reach out to Lorena at the email address provided here for questions related to the Nature Framework. Thank you to all of our participants today and our speakers, and of course to the Biodiversity Consultancy for helping us develop the methodology and quantification approach. Have a good rest of your days, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.